Chronicles of the Grim Reaper, Before You, by Griz Calderon. Catarina had passed the church of San Francisco more times than she could have counted. As a girl, she passed it holding tightly to her mother's hand. Later, she walked by carrying bread beneath one arm, or cloth that needed mending for someone who lived across the city. When her knees began to complain about Évora's stone streets, she passed more slowly. The church changed during those years. So did Catarina. The Grim Reaper saw both. He first noticed her when she was 6 years old, although she did not see him. She had followed a funeral procession farther than she had been allowed to go. Someone from a neighboring household had died, and curiosity carried her along behind the adults until she found herself standing near an open grave. The coffin disappeared into the earth. Catarina stared. "Will they stay there forever?" she whispered. The woman beside her looked down, surprised by the question. "The dead?" Catarina nodded. The woman considered this before taking the child's hand. "For as long as they need to." It was an answer meant to satisfy a 6-year-old. It did not. A short distance away, beneath the shade of a wall, the Grim Reaper stood watching her. He was tall beneath a long black robe, its folds falling around him without revealing the shape beneath. A deep hood covered his head, and inside it there was only darkness, a black void where a face should have been. His hands were black as well, nothing like the skeletal hands people had imagined belonged to the figure who came for the dead. Beside him stood his scythe, its long handle rising to a curved blade above his shoulder. His robe stirred faintly, although the air around him was still. Catarina looked directly toward him. Once. Her eyes passed over the dark figure without stopping. He had not chosen to let her see him. There was no reason yet. Catarina grew up in Évora when the city was crowded with churches, convents, houses, and people. Bells marked the hours, carts rattled over stone. The streets filled early, and voices carried easily between buildings. The dead were part of the city too. They rested beside churches and within religious grounds that had received generations of people before Catarina was born. Families returned to those places to pray. Fresh earth settled. Markers weathered. Another generation arrived. Catarina eventually stopped wondering whether the dead remained beneath the ground forever. There was too much living to do. She became a seamstress. Her hands were good at small things. She could replace a button so neatly that its owner forgot it had ever been missing. She repaired torn sleeves and shortened dresses for children who had inherited them from older sisters. When money was scarce, she accepted eggs, bread, or whatever could reasonably be offered. She married. She buried her husband. Years later, she buried a child. The Grim Reaper was there both times. Catarina did not see him at her husband's grave. She stood among the mourners with her hands folded against her stomach, listening as earth struck wood below. That evening she set out 2 cups before supper. She stared at the second one for a while. Then she returned it to the shelf. When her child died many years later, she did see the Reaper. Only for a moment. He stood at the far end of the room as Catarina held a hand that had already grown still. Catarina looked at him. She did not scream. Perhaps grief had left no room for fear. "Did you take her?" The Grim Reaper gave no answer. He never did. Catarina looked down again. By the time she raised her head, he was gone. For years afterward, she remembered him. She never told anyone. Age softened some things and sharpened others. Catarina forgot where she had placed her scissors but could remember exactly how her husband laughed when he was young. She sometimes woke, believing she had heard her child in the next room. She knew better once she was fully awake. Still, there were mornings when she left the bed reluctantly. Her work kept her among people. That helped. She stitched christening clothes for babies whose parents had once stood on stools while she measured their hems. She repaired mourning clothes that had already belonged to several members of the same family. She watched children become parents, and parents become grandparents. Death continued to pass through Évora. So did life. The burial grounds continued filling. Land inside the city walls could not stretch simply because people needed more of it. Graves that had once seemed permanent occupied earth required by later generations. Around churches and convents, the problem became increasingly difficult to ignore. Catarina knew little about such matters. She only knew where she wanted to be buried. There was a place beside the church where people she had loved already rested. She had visited it for years, sometimes bringing flowers, and sometimes bringing nothing at all. Toward the end of her life, walking there became difficult. One afternoon she sat beside the burial ground longer than usual. The Grim Reaper stood nearby. This time, Catarina saw him immediately. She studied him with the familiarity one might give a person encountered once many years before. You. He remained where he was. She looked toward the graves. I remember you. A breeze moved through the trees. His robe did not answer it. The dark cloth shifted faintly around him, stirring in the strange way it always did, as though moved by something older than wind. Catarina waited. Nothing happened. Finally, she laughed. You're not here for me today, are you? The Reaper did not move. Good, she said. I have work waiting. She pushed herself up from the bench and went home. He watched her leave. Her final day came several years later. There was nothing remarkable about the morning. Catarina ate a little bread. She opened the shutters. She sat near the window with a garment across her lap and threaded a needle. Her fingers were slower now. She made several stitches before stopping to rest. The Grim Reaper appeared beside the doorway. Catarina noticed him without looking startled. I wondered when you would come back. He stepped into the room. She set the sewing aside. For a moment she examined the small home in which so much of her life had taken place. The table bore scratches made by people who were no longer alive. A repaired cup sat near the basin. Cloth waited in a basket for work she would never finish. Catarina touched the garment on her lap. Someone will have to do this. The Reaper waited. She smiled slightly. That isn't your concern, is it? He extended his hand. Catarina looked at it. She had feared this hand once. Now she thought about the people he had stood beside before her. Her husband, her child, others whose funerals she had attended and whose names were slowly disappearing from conversation. She placed her hand in his. Her body remained in the chair. Catarina stood beside it. She stared at herself for several seconds before looking at the Reaper. So, that's all? He turned toward the doorway. Catarina followed. She did not look back again. Her body was prepared for burial. People gathered. Prayers were spoken. Someone cried into a handkerchief Catarina herself had once repaired. Then the earth received what remained of her. Years passed. Évora continued to change. The living needed places to build, to worship, and eventually to bury their own dead. The old burial grounds had become crowded with generations whose families were themselves sometimes gone. The Franciscan friars faced a problem that could no longer be solved by finding another narrow piece of earth. The graves could be opened. The bones could be removed. But what should be done with them? These had been people. Whatever practical problem their remains created, throwing them away would deny what those burial places had meant. The solution was unusual. The bones would remain in consecrated space. They would be brought into a chapel. The Grim Reaper returned when the work began. He watched as old graves were opened. There was no violence in it. The people who lifted the remains worked carefully, gathering bones that had rested beneath Évora for years from soil that was needed again. The Grim Reaper knew them all. He had stood beside each of them when their lives ended. He remembered the old and the young, those who had reached for his hand, and those who had needed time before they were ready to leave. Long before their names disappeared from markers or from the memories of the living, he had carried each soul away from the body, now being uncovered. Then the workers reached another grave. The Reaper watched as the earth was cleared and the remains beneath it were carefully lifted. He knew them before anyone could have told him whose grave it had been. Catarina. He remembered her sitting beside the burial ground and asking if he had come for her. He remembered finding her years later near the window, with a garment across her lap, work still waiting in the basket beside her. He remembered the moment she finally placed her hand in his. Now there were only bones. There was nothing of Catarina within them. He knew that better than anyone. Catarina had left this place with him long ago. Still, he remained as her bones were gathered with the others. The bones were carried to the Church of San Francisco with thousands of others taken from burial grounds around Évora. The friars could have hidden them. They chose not to. Skulls were placed where they could be seen. Long bones were arranged across walls and around pillars. Human remains became part of the architecture itself. The work took patience. A skull could not reveal whether its owner had once been wealthy or poor. A femur offered no clue about whose legs had carried it through the streets. The bones of people who would never have shared a table in life now rested inches apart. Catarina's bones lost themselves among them. The Reaper watched the walls rise. He understood what the living were trying to do. The chapel solved the problem of crowded burial grounds, but the friars had made the solution say something. The dead had not vanished merely because their graves were needed. They had been given another place. Visitors entering the chapel would have to face them. Not as portraits, not as names carved into expensive stone, as human beings reduced to what every human body eventually becomes. Above the entrance, words were placed for those who came after. Nós ossos que aqui estamos pelos vossos esperamos. We bones that are here await yours. Centuries passed. The warning remained. People came from places Catarina had never known existed. They stepped through the entrance and stopped when they saw the walls. Some were unsettled. Others moved closer. They looked into the empty eyes of skulls and wondered who these people had been. The answer was everywhere around them. They had been ordinary. They had walked the same streets beneath the Portuguese sun. They had bought food and mended clothing. They had buried people they loved. They had complained about aching knees. They had left work unfinished. One skull among thousands had belonged to a woman who once put 2 cups on a table because, for a moment, she had forgotten her husband was dead. No visitor could know that. The Grim Reaper did. He sometimes stood inside the chapel, while people passed him without seeing. He watched them study the bones. Most eventually looked at their own hands. That was the part he understood best. The chapel had never really been asking visitors to stare at the dead. It was asking them to notice that they were alive. The bones had already had their turn beneath the sun. Now the people standing before them had theirs. And somewhere within the walls of the Chapel of Bones, among thousands of others, Catarina remained. Not her soul, not the woman who had laughed, sewn crooked hems straight, and once asked the reaper whether he had come for her too soon. Only what she had left behind. It was enough to make a stranger stop for a moment and think about what they might do with the time still given to them. The end.